I told her, my divorce didn't destroy this family. It was the beginning of something honest. The words came out quieter than I expected, almost calm, and that seemed to shock her more than if I had shouted. She was standing in the doorway of the living room, arms crossed, eyes already tired of a conversation she hadn't even let fully begin. Outside, the late afternoon light slanted through the blinds, cutting the room into narrow strips of golden shadow. It felt fitting. For years, my life had been divided the same way. Thin slices of peace interrupted by long shadows of silence, resentment, and pretending everything was fine. When she laughed, a short, disbelieving sound, I knew she thought I was rewriting history to make myself feel better. That's not how it felt to the rest of us, she said. And that was the moment I realized how differently the same marriage can be experienced by the people living inside it. For 21 years, I had been the man who held things together quietly. Not the loud, dramatic kind of husband who storms out or slams doors, but the steady one who absorbs tension like a wall absorbs heat. I was the one who woke up early, paid the bills, made sure the car had gas, made sure birthdays were remembered and emergencies were handled. From the outside, we looked like a family that had figured it out. Friends would tell us we were solid, the kind of couple younger people pointed to and said, "That's what lasting love looks like." I used to smile when they said that. I didn't correct them. I didn't tell them that lasting doesn't always mean healthy or that quiet doesn't always mean peaceful. The cracks didn't appear all at once. They never do. They start as small compromises you tell yourself don't matter. I stopped bringing up certain topics because they led to arguments. I stopped sharing ideas because they were met with sighs or eye rolls. I told myself this was maturity, that this was what grown-ups did to keep families intact. When our children were young, I convinced myself it was noble to swallow frustration for the sake of stability. And when they grew older, I told myself it was too late to change the rules. By the time I noticed how invisible I'd become in my own home, I was already used to the feeling. The first time the word divorce crossed my mind, it wasn't during a fight. It was on a random Tuesday morning while I was sitting alone at the kitchen table, drinking coffee that had gone cold. She was already gone for the day, and the house was quiet in a way that felt less like calm and more like abandonment. I remember staring at a small crack in the wall near the window and thinking, almost casually, if nothing changed, this would be my life forever. The thought didn't scare me at first, it just made me tired, deeply tired in a way sleep couldn't fix. We tried counseling because that's what you're supposed to do when things feel off. We sat on opposite ends of a couch in a beige room with framed motivational quotes on the wall, and we took turns explaining our feelings like we were reading from separate instruction manuals written in different languages. She said she felt unsupported, overwhelmed, like she carried the emotional weight of the family alone. I listened, nodded, tried to understand. When it was my turn, I said I felt invisible, unheard, like my role had been reduced to maintenance rather than partnership. The therapist asked her how that made her feel. She paused, then said, I didn't realize he felt that way. And that was the problem in one sentence. Not anger, not hatred, just a profound lack of awareness that had been growing for years. The day we finally decided to divorce was strangely quiet. No shouting, no dramatic declarations, just a conversation that felt like the end of a long negotiation neither of us remembered starting. We sat at the dining table, the same table where we'd celebrated holidays, birthdays, and small victories. She said she didn't think we were making each other better anymore. I agreed. Saying it out loud felt like stepping into cold water, shocking but clarifying. We talked about logistics before emotions, about schedules and finances and how to explain things to the kids. It was efficient, almost businesslike, and that scared me more than if we had fought. It meant we were already emotionally detached. Telling the family was harder, not because I doubted the decision, but because I knew how it would be framed. Divorce is still seen as a failure, especially when you've been married a long time. It doesn't matter how much effort you put in or how quietly you endured things. The story people hear is simple. Something broke. Someone gave up. I could see it in their faces as we explained, the unspoken question hanging in the air. Who was at fault? I didn't offer an answer. I didn't defend myself. I just said we both deserved a chance to live honestly, and that this decision wasn't about escape, but about truth. The weeks that followed were disorienting. The house felt different without her presence. Like a stage after the actors have left, but the lights are still on. I moved through rooms more slowly, noticing things I hadn't before. The way the floor creaked near the hallway, the faint hum of the refrigerator at night. There was grief, of course. You don't erase decades of shared life without feeling loss. But there was also something unexpected. Relief. The constant low-level tension I'd lived with for years was gone. I could breathe without bracing myself for the next sigh, the next dismissal, the next unspoken disappointment. When I said, my divorce meant our family's new beginning, I wasn't trying to sound poetic or profound. I was stating a fact I had only recently understood myself. Divorce didn't erase our history or our responsibilities to each other, especially as parents. What it did was strip away the illusion that staying together at any cost was the same as staying healthy. For the first time in years, conversations felt real, not filtered through resentment or obligation. Boundaries became clearer. Expectations were finally spoken instead of assumed. She didn't see it that way, not at first. To her, the divorce was a rupture, an ending she hadn't wanted to explain to others. She saw it as loss, embarrassment, a fracture in the image she had built of our life. And I understood that. But understanding someone else's pain doesn't mean denying your own truth. Standing there in that living room, watching her struggle with the idea that something good could come from what felt like failure, I realized this was the real beginning. Not just of separate lives, but of a different kind of family. One built on honesty instead of endurance, on choice instead of obligation. I didn't know yet how hard that transition would be, or how much resistance I would face, or how many times I would question myself in the quiet moments. I only knew one thing with certainty. Going back to the way things were was no longer an option. The door had closed, and for the first time in a long while, I wasn't afraid of what lay on the other side. What I didn't anticipate was how uncomfortable honesty would make everyone else once the structure they were used to disappeared. For years, our family had relied on predictability more than communication. We knew our roles, even if we didn't like them. I was the stable one, the mediator, the person who kept things from falling apart quietly in the background. She was the organizer, the emotional center, the one whose feelings set the tone of the house. The kids learned early how to adjust themselves to avoid conflict. Once the marriage ended, those unspoken rules stopped working, and without them, everyone felt exposed. The first real test came a few weeks after the divorce was finalized, during what was supposed to be a simple family dinner. We agreed to meet at a neutral place, a small restaurant we used to like when the kids were younger. I arrived early, sat at a corner table, and watched families come and go, laughing, arguing, living in ways that felt strangely distant now. When she walked in with the kids, I could sense the tension immediately. Not hostility, but uncertainty. They didn't know how to act around me anymore. I wasn't the husband in the house, but I wasn't gone either. I was something new, undefined, and that made them nervous. Conversation stayed on the surface at first. Work, traffic, harmless updates. Then one of the kids asked, "So, how are you really doing?" It was a genuine question, but it carried weight. I paused, realizing that for years I would have answered automatically. "I'm fine." This time I didn't. I said, "I'm figuring things out. Some days are hard, some days feel lighter than I expected." The table went quiet. Not because what I said was dramatic, but because it was real. They weren't used to hearing me speak that way. Vulnerability from me had always been rare. Not because I didn't feel things, but because I'd learned it was easier to be the steady one. After dinner, she pulled me aside outside the restaurant. The air was cold, sharp, and I could see my breath as I spoke. "You didn't have to say all that," she said, not angrily, but with concern that sounded a lot like discomfort. "They don't need to know everything." I looked at her and realized how deeply ingrained that mindset was. Protect the image. Keep things contained. Don't make anyone uncomfortable. "They're adults," I replied, "and they deserve to know who I am now, not just who I was expected to be." She didn't argue, but I could tell she wasn't convinced. In the months that followed, the shifts became more obvious. The kids started calling me directly instead of going through her. Small things at first, advice about work, questions about life decisions they'd usually frame carefully to avoid disagreement. I noticed something interesting when I spoke honestly without trying to soften. But with each difficult conversation, I felt a strange sense of alignment, like my words and my thoughts were finally coming from the same place. One afternoon, months after the divorce, my daughter came over unexpectedly. She sat at the kitchen counter while I made coffee, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You're different," she said finally. Not accusing, not praising, just observant. I asked what she meant. She shrugged. "You don't seem smaller anymore." That word landed harder than anything else she could have said. Smaller. I realized then how much of myself I had compressed over the years, how subtly and consistently I had learned to take up less space emotionally so others could feel comfortable. The real turning point came during a family discussion that would have been impossible before. It started as a disagreement about a holiday plan, something trivial on the surface. Voices rose. Old patterns threatened to reassert themselves. Normally, I would have stepped back, let others decide, told myself it didn't matter. This time I didn't. I stated my preference clearly, explained why it mattered to me, and then stopped talking. No justifications, no apologies. The room went quiet again, but this silence was different. It wasn't avoidance. It was consideration. For the first time, my perspective wasn't treated as an obstacle to work around, but as a valid part of the discussion. Afterwards, she confronted me privately. "You're changing the rules," she said. I nodded. "Yes," I replied, "because the old rules weren't working." She looked at me for a long moment, and in her eyes I saw something I hadn't seen in years. Uncertainty mixed with respect. Not agreement, not affection, but recognition. She was finally seeing that the man she'd once dismissed as difficult wasn't trying to control or criticize. He was trying to exist honestly. That was when it hit me fully. The divorce wasn't the breaking point everyone feared. It was the reset, the uncomfortable, necessary reset that forced all of us to renegotiate how we related to each other. It stripped away the assumptions and exposed the cost of silence. It made room for conversations that had been postponed for years because they felt inconvenient or disruptive. And while it hurt, sometimes deeply, it also created space for growth that simply couldn't happen inside the old structure. By the end of that year, our family didn't look the way it used to. We didn't gather out of obligation. We didn't pretend everything was fine. But when we came together, it was intentional. Conversations were messier, more honest, sometimes awkward, but real. I wasn't the invisible stabilizer anymore. I was a participant, flawed and opinionated and present. And even though not everyone liked that version of me all the time, I knew something fundamental had changed for the better. The longer I lived inside this new version of our family, the more I understood something I wish I had realized years earlier. Peace built on silence is not peace at all. It's just delay. Delay of conflict, delay of truth, delay of the inevitable reckoning that comes when people stop pretending. Divorce didn't magically fix us. What it did was remove the final excuse we had for not dealing with reality. There was no longer a shared roof to hide under, no routine to lean on when conversations got uncomfortable. Everything we were had to be chosen deliberately or it would disappear. At first, that terrified me. When you spend decades holding things together, you start to believe that if you stop, everything will fall apart. I'd built part of my identity around being necessary in that way. Letting go of it felt like stepping off a cliff without knowing if there was ground below. But slowly, I began to see that the family didn't collapse without my quiet sacrifices. It adjusted. Awkwardly at times, painfully at others, but it adjusted. And in that adjustment, something healthier started to form. There were setbacks, of course, moments when old resentments resurfaced, when someone would say, "This wouldn't have happened if you hadn't left," or "Things were easier before." Those words used to cut deeply. I'd replay them in my head, wondering if I really had destroyed something that could have been saved. But over time, I learned to hear what was underneath them. Fear, loss, the discomfort of change, not truth. People often mistake familiarity for happiness. Losing the familiar feels like losing safety, even when that familiarity was quietly hurting everyone involved. One evening stands out clearly. We were sitting together after a long day, the conversation drifting the way it often did now, less guarded, more reflective. Someone mentioned how different things felt compared to before. There was a pause, and then one of them said, almost reluctantly, I think we talk more now than we ever did when you were married. No one laughed. No one argued. It was said softly, like an observation that surprised even the person who said it. And in that moment, I felt a strange mix of sadness and validation. Sadness for all the years it took to get here, and validation that the cost of change hadn't been meaningless. I also changed in ways I didn't expect. Without the constant need to manage everyone else's comfort, I had more mental space than I'd had in decades. I picked up old interests I'd abandoned because they were inconvenient or met with indifference. I reconnected with people I'd slowly drifted away from because my world had shrunk to the size of my obligations. I learned how to sit with discomfort instead of smoothing it over. That was perhaps the hardest lesson. Letting someone be upset with you, disappointed in you, or unsure about you without rushing in to fix it requires a level of self-trust I hadn't developed before. She and I eventually reached a place of mutual understanding, not friendship in the traditional sense, but respect. We could acknowledge what we had been to each other without rewriting the past to make it more comfortable. We talked openly about our failures, our blind spots, the ways we'd both contributed to the slow erosion of intimacy. Those conversations weren't easy, but they were honest. And honesty, I learned, is far more durable than harmony built on avoidance. Looking back now, I see how dangerous the idea of holding it together can be when it becomes an excuse to stop growing. Families don't need perfection. They need truth. They need people who are willing to be seen fully, even when that visibility creates friction. For a long time, I thought love meant endurance, staying quiet, sacrificing endlessly. Now I understand that love also means courage, the courage to say, this isn't working, and to accept whatever comes after. When I said my divorce meant our family's new beginning, I wasn't celebrating the end of a marriage. I was acknowledging the start of something more honest than what we'd had before. A family where relationships are chosen, not assumed. Where conversations happen because they matter, not because they're expected. Where respect isn't conditional on silence or compliance. If you're listening to this and you're in a place where everything looks fine on the outside but feels suffocating on the inside, I want you to know something. Endings are not always failures. Sometimes they are corrections. Sometimes they are the bravest thing you can do for yourself and for the people you love. Change will cost you comfort. It may cost you approval, but it can also give you back your voice, your clarity, and your sense of self. I don't regret choosing honesty over appearance. I don't regret refusing to keep shrinking to preserve a version of family that no longer fit who we were. What I regret is how long it took me to believe that my presence mattered even when I wasn't holding everything together. And if there's one thing I hope this story leaves you with, it's this. You are allowed to choose a life that doesn't require you to disappear. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt invisible, unheard, or trapped in a role that no longer reflects who you are, take a moment to reflect on what honesty might look like in your own life. And if you want more stories like this, stories about difficult choices, quiet transformations, and finding clarity after everything changes, consider staying here. Sometimes the most powerful new beginnings start where we're told everything is supposed to end.